The sky burned with streaks of orange and crimson as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the quiet countryside. Robert Stevens tightened the strap on his helmet and exhaled, the cool evening air filling his lungs. His motorcycle, a sleek black Harley-Davidson, rumbled beneath him, waiting for the open road. "You sure you don't want to come?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at Peg and Charlie, who stood near the porch of his house. Peg, his wife of 12 years, gave him a soft smile, but there was something distant in her eyes. She was barefoot, her arms wrapped around herself, as if shielding from a chill that wasn't there. "I'm exhausted, babe. It's been a long day." Charlie, his best friend since high school, took a swig from his beer and smirked. "Nah, man, you go ahead. I'll keep Peg company." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourselves." There was nothing unusual about the moment, nothing that should have raised alarm bells. But looking back, he would remember it differently. The way Peg hesitated before going back inside. The way Charlie leaned a little too casually against the railing, watching him leave. He should have known. The wind roared as Robert tore down the empty road, the world around him dissolving into a blur of trees and open fields. He had always loved these rides. They were his escape, his way of clearing his mind. Lately, things have been off, subtle shifts in Peg's behavior, conversations that stopped when he entered the room, Charlie showing up a little too often when he wasn't home. But he had pushed those thoughts away. Until now. A set of headlights flickered in his side mirror. A truck, its engine growling like some mechanical beast, appeared behind him. Robert frowned. The road was usually deserted at this hour. He switched lanes, expecting the truck to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it sped up. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Robert gripped the handlebars tighter, accelerating. The wind screamed past his ears, the road ahead a black ribbon stretching into the unknown. But the truck stayed with him, closing the distance. His pulse pounded. What the hell was this guy doing? Then, impact. A violent jolt sent his bike skidding sideways. His body lurched forward as the front wheel wobbled uncontrollably. He fought for control, his heart slamming against his ribs. Gravel sprayed as he veered toward the edge of the road. Another hit. The world tilted. The sound of screeching tires and shattering glass filled his ears as the asphalt rushed up to meet him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the driver of the truck. Pedro, Charlie's worker. And then, darkness. Darkness had weight. It pressed against Robert's mind, thick and suffocating, like the ocean floor crushing everything beneath it. Time had no meaning in this abyss, only pain. Distant voices echoed, blurred and warped. A beeping sound, steady and rhythmic, tethered him to existence. Then a gasp. His own. His eyes flickered open, fighting against the blinding white light that poured in from above. The world returned in fragments, an antiseptic smell, the rough texture of a blanket against his skin, the dull ache that pulsed through his body like a slow-moving fire. A hospital. He tried to sit up, but agony seized his ribs, forcing him back against the pillow. His throat was dry, his limbs leaden, machines beeped beside him, tubes snaked into his arms, and a bandage wrapped tight around his head. "You're awake." The voice was soft, uncertain. He turned his head, slowly, painfully, and saw her. Peg, his wife. Her blue eyes were wide, rimmed with exhaustion and something else. Guilt? No, that couldn't be right. But something was off. "Peg." His voice was a rasping whisper, dry as sandpaper. Tears welled up in her eyes as she grabbed his hand, squeezing it as if trying to ground herself in reality. "Oh, Robert, you were in an accident. You almost died." "An accident." The words rattled inside his skull, disjointed and distant. Then, memories surfaced, fast and sharp, like a blade slashing through water. The motorcycle ride, the headlights behind him, the truck, the impact. A flash of terror gripped him, sending ice through his veins. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice through cracked lips. Ooh, who hit me? Peg hesitated. Too long. The delay wasn't just because of shock or sadness. It was something else, something deliberate. I, I don't know, she finally said. The police said it was a hit and run. No one saw the driver. Lies. The memory of the crash wasn't whole, but one thing stood out in jagged clarity. The driver's face, framed in the yellow glow of the dashboard. Pedro, Charlie's right-hand man. A sick feeling twisted in Robert's gut. Charlie, his best friend, the man he trusted more than anyone. A friend who would have been at his bedside, cracking bad jokes, and sneaking in whiskey if he had really cared. But Charlie wasn't there. The air between him and Peg grew thick with unspoken words. He watched her carefully now, his foggy mind clearing, focusing. Her lips were chapped. Her hair, usually neat, was in a careless ponytail. She had been here for a while. But was it out of devotion or obligation? How long? He asked. 3 weeks, she said softly. 3 weeks. He had been in a coma for nearly a month. And in all that time, Charlie hadn't come, hadn't called, hadn't even sent flowers. Something wasn't right. Before he could press further, the door creaked open. A shadow loomed in the doorway, and Robert's body tensed on instinct. Pedro. The man stepped in with an unnatural ease, carrying a bouquet of cheap gas station flowers. His dark eyes flicked toward Robert, measuring him before he offered a too-wide smile. Senor Stevens, Pedro said, his voice thick with false warmth. Good to see you awake, amigo. You had us worried. Robert held his gaze, ignoring the burning pain in his ribs. Did I? Pedro placed the flowers on the nightstand and shoved his hands into his pockets. See, it was a terrible accident. His tone was casual, too casual. But, hey, you're a tough guy. Lucky to. Lucky? Robert's fingers curled into the sheets. I remember the truck, he said slowly. I remember you behind the wheel. The room went silent. Peg stiffened beside him, her breath catching in her throat. Pedro, however, didn't flinch. Instead, his smile faded, replaced by something colder. Calculating. Your memory must be fuzzy, senor, Pedro said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You had a head injury. Sometimes the mind plays tricks. Robert's jaw clenched. The arrogance, the sheer audacity of this man standing in front of him, lying so smoothly. He glanced at Peg. She wasn't looking at Pedro. She was staring down at her lap, her fingers tangled together, her shoulders tense. She knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the full truth, but she knew enough to be afraid. Robert forced his breathing to steady, keeping his voice level. Why are you really here, Pedro? The man chuckled, as if Robert had just asked a foolish question. He reached into his pocket, and Robert's muscles coiled, ready for anything. But all Pedro pulled out was a debit card and a small bag. He tossed them onto the hospital bed. Charlie wanted me to give you these, he said. A little help while you recover. He figured you need a fresh start somewhere far away. A fresh start. The implication was clear. Leave. Disappear. Forget this ever happened. And if he didn't? Pedro tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes gleaming with a silent threat. Robert exhaled slowly, his mind racing despite the haze of painkillers dulling his senses. He could play along. He could pretend to be broken, confused, grateful even. Or he could fight. He met Pedro's gaze, refusing to blink. Tell Charlie I'll think about it. Pedro smirked. Good choice, amigo. He turned to leave, but just before stepping out the door, he glanced back. Be smart, Senor Stevens, he murmured. Not everyone gets a second chance. Then he was gone. The silence left in his wake was suffocating. Robert turned to Peg, his pulse pounding. How long have you known? Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't speak. That was answer enough. Robert lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, his world spinning out of control. His best friend had betrayed him. His wife had let it happen. And they thought he was going to just walk away? Not a chance. The beeping of the hospital monitor was the only sound filling the sterile white room. The air smelled of antiseptic, masking the staleness of weeks gone by. Robert lay motionless, his body still weak, his mind swimming in confusion. He had barely pieced together the fragments of what had happened: his accident, Pedro's truck, Charlie's betrayal, when a shadow slipped into the room. Pedro! Robert's fingers twitched under the blanket, instinctively balling into a fist. But he was too weak to fight. He could only watch as the man approached, his dark eyes unreadable, his posture tense but confident. Pedro pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down, resting his forearms on his knees. He exhaled sharply, as if this conversation was a weight on his chest. "You should have died that night, amigo." Robert's breath hitched, a cold chill creeping up his spine. The words were delivered with unsettling calmness, as if they were a simple fact, not an attempted murder confession. Pedro smirked, sensing Robert's unease. "But you didn't, so now we have a problem." Robert forced his dry throat to work. "Charlie sent you." Pedro nodded. "He thought you were in the way. You see, your wife, she wasn't supposed to be yours anymore. Charlie, he's had his eyes on Peg for a long time." Robert's stomach twisted violently. "Liar," he rasped, but the look in Pedro's eyes told him otherwise. "Believe what you want, amigo. But the moment you hit the pavement, Charlie moved in. He made sure Peg never looked back." Robert wanted to scream. He wanted to lunge at Pedro and tear the truth from his throat. But he was trapped, his body betraying him. Pedro reached into his jacket and pulled out a small plastic bag, tossing it onto Robert's lap. It landed with a soft, lifeless thud. "There, a few $100, and this." He slid a debit card onto the bed beside the bag. "Charlie's generous. He says you take this money, disappear, and stay dead. If you don't, well." Pedro leaned in close, his breath warm and reeking of cheap cigars. "Next time I won't miss." The room spun. The beeping of the heart monitor quickened. Pedro stood, adjusting his jacket. "Get up. We're leaving." Robert stared at him in disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere." Pedro chuckled. "You think you have a choice? You're already dead to them. To her." The words burned worse than any injury. 2 hours later, under the cover of night, Robert was wheeled out of the hospital. No discharge papers. No explanations. Just a man disappearing into the abyss, forgotten by the life he had once built. The last thing he saw as Pedro's car pulled away was the silhouette of his old house in the distance, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness. Inside, Peg and Charlie were building a life that should have been his. And Robert? He was nothing but a ghost. The world outside had moved on, but Robert Stevens remained frozen in time, trapped in the ruins of the life he once knew. The man who had walked into that hospital, trusting, devoted, and full of purpose, was gone. In his place was a ghost, wandering aimlessly through a world that had discarded him. Pedro had left him at the edge of a homeless encampment, a place where forgotten souls gathered beneath a crumbling overpass, sharing stories of loss, addiction, and survival. The air smelled of damp earth, sweat, and burnt food. Shopping carts lined the walkways like relics of past lives, filled with plastic bags, old blankets, and discarded memories. Robert sat on a wooden crate, staring at the meager belongings Pedro had left him. A small bag of cash, a prepaid debit card, and a cheap burner phone. Hush money. That first night, he didn't sleep. His body ached from injuries only half healed, but the pain inside was worse. Peg, the woman he had loved, trusted, built a life with. She was gone. Worse, she had moved on without him. With Charlie, his best friend, his brother. Every time he closed his eyes, images flashed in his mind. Charlie's laughter at their wedding, the nights they spent fixing up cars together, the times Charlie had sworn he'd take a bullet for him. Lies. All of it. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. At first, Robert refused to believe it. Maybe Pedro had been lying. Maybe Peg had been forced into it. Maybe, just maybe, there was another explanation. But as time wore on, reality sank its claws into him. He had no home to return to, no family waiting for him. He had vanished, and no one had come looking. With no identification, no official records, and no way to prove he existed, Robert became another nameless face in the underbelly of the city. He found work where he could, washing dishes, lifting heavy crates, cleaning alleys for a few bucks under the table. He learned how to navigate the streets, how to avoid the dangers of the night, and how to disappear in plain sight. Alcohol numbed the pain at first. Whiskey burned away his memories, dulling the betrayal that gnawed at his soul. Some nights, he would drink himself into a stupor, hoping to wake up and find that it had all been a nightmare. But the nightmare never ended. Robert might have wasted away entirely if it weren't for Mary. She was a woman who carried her own shadows. Mid-40s, wiry and sharp-eyed, she had once been a nurse, but life had dealt her a cruel hand. An abusive husband had broken her spirit, and when she finally escaped, the system failed her. Robert first met her on a bitter winter night. He had been huddled by a makeshift fire, the cold slicing through his tattered jacket. She sat beside him without a word, pulling her coat tighter around herself. It was the first time someone had sat beside him without pity. Over time, they talked, or rather, she talked, and he listened. She told him about the man who had taken everything from her, about the years she spent running, about how survival turned you into something you never thought you'd become. One evening, she finally asked, "What about you, Robert? What broke you?" For the first time, he spoke his truth. He told her about Peg, about Charlie, about how he had trusted them with everything, only to be discarded like a loose thread in their perfect little world. Mary listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply nodded. "You're not dead, Robert. They tried to kill you, but you're still here. That means something." The words lodged themselves in his mind. "You're still here." For the first time in years, Robert felt something other than despair. It took time, but Robert began to pull himself back together. He stopped drinking. He found steadier work. He started to rebuild the strength in his body, forcing himself to wake up early and push through the stiffness in his limbs. The fire inside him, long buried under grief, began to flicker back to life. And then, one night, it roared into an inferno. Mary was reading an old newspaper she had scavenged from a nearby diner. She was flipping through absent-mindedly when she froze. Her breath hitched. "Robert," she whispered. He looked up from where he was sharpening a rusted knife. Mary turned the newspaper around. Right there, in bold letters, was the headline. Wealthy businessman Charles Ford engaged to longtime companion Peg Stevens. A photograph sat below the words. There they were, Charlie and Peg, standing in front of an elegant ballroom, locked in a picture-perfect embrace. Peg was dressed in a flowing silver gown, her smile radiant, while Charlie stood beside her, his hand possessively resting on her waist. The caption beneath the image read, "A love that blossomed from tragedy." The paper crumpled in Robert's hands. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. Mary watched him carefully. "What are you going to do?" Robert's jaw clenched. He had spent years suffering in silence. Years pretending he was dead. Years letting them win. But no more. He looked up, eyes burning with purpose. "I'm going home." The night air was thick with the scent of pine and distant rain, the kind of evening Robert had once loved to spend on his porch with Peg, sipping a beer and talking about nothing at all. But that life was long gone. Now he stood at the edge of the driveway of the house they had once shared, his house, watching from the shadows as light spilled through the windows. The warmth inside was deceiving. For years, Robert had imagined this moment. He had pictured himself storming through the door, demanding answers, demanding justice. But now that he was here, a strange hesitation gripped him. What if Peg wasn't the woman he had left behind? What if she had never been the woman he thought she was? The front door creaked open, and his breath caught in his throat. There she was, Peg Stevens, his wife, his betrayer, stepped onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. She looked almost the same delicate face, the same soft waves of chestnut hair, though a few strands had turned silver in his absence. But there was something different in her eyes, even from this distance. A shadow, a sadness. Then she turned, and for the first time in years, their eyes met. For a moment, she didn't move. Her face paled, her lips parted as though forming a name she no longer believed was possible. Then she staggered forward, gripping the wooden railing for support. "Robert, oh my God!" The words were barely a whisper, choked by disbelief. Robert stepped out of the shadows, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't know what he expected her to do: scream, cry, beg for forgiveness. But the way she looked at him, like she was seeing a ghost, made the anger in his chest falter for just a second. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They told me you were dead." Robert scoffed, his bitterness returning like a flood. "They?" he echoed, stepping closer. "You mean Charlie? Your new fiancé?" Peg flinched at the venom in his words. Her hands were shaking now, gripping the railing like it was the only thing holding her up. "No, Robert, you don't understand. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know." He studied her face, looking for deception, looking for the woman who had betrayed him. But all he saw was raw shock. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked coldly. "That you just never wondered? Never questioned why your husband vanished without a trace?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I did question it. I did," she cried. "Charlie told me you crashed your bike, that you didn't make it, that there was nothing left to find. And then Pedro." She swallowed hard, shaking her head. He showed me something that convinced me it was true." Robert clenched his fists. "What did he show you, Peg?" She hesitated, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Your wedding ring." Robert's breath caught. Peg let out a broken laugh, brushing her hand across her face. "They gave it to me in a little box. They let me cry over it. Charlie, he held me while I mourned you. And I let him." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Oh God, I let him." Robert stared at her, his mind racing. It had all been a lie, every last piece of it. Charlie had orchestrated the entire thing: his attempted murder, his disappearance, and then Peg's grief. And when she was weak, when she was vulnerable, Charlie had stepped in to replace him. "You don't know how much I loved you," Peg whispered, her voice breaking. "How much I still love you." Robert's heart twisted painfully. "Then why did you marry him?" Peg inhaled sharply, as if the question had physically struck her. Her gaze dropped to the ground. "Because I was broken. Because I had no one. Because I thought he was all I had left." Silence stretched between them. For years, Robert had told himself he hated her, that if he ever saw her again, he would throw her betrayal in her face and walk away. But now, standing here, looking into the eyes of the woman he had once promised forever to, he realized something horrifying. She hadn't betrayed him. She had been deceived just like he had. He had been robbed of his life, and she had been robbed of the truth. "Peg," he said softly, his voice hoarse, "we're going to make him pay for what he did to us." Her eyes widened. And for the first time since he had returned, Robert saw something in her gaze that he hadn't expected. Hope. The night air was thick with humidity as Robert stood outside the house that had once been his home. The glow from the windows painted the lawn in warm, golden hues, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the ice gripping his chest. He could see her inside, Peg, sitting at the dining room table, staring blankly at a half-empty glass of wine. This wasn't the woman he had loved. Her shoulders were slumped, her once bright eyes hollowed by something deeper than age. She was trapped. Even from here, Robert could see it. His heart pounded as he stepped forward and knocked. A moment passed, then another. When the door finally creaked open, Peg stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Her skin turned ghostly pale, and for a brief moment, Robert thought she might faint. "Robert," She whispered, gripping the doorframe for support. "Oh my God, I thought you were dead." He let the silence stretch, watching her, searching for the truth in her face. "No thanks to you," he said finally, his voice a quiet storm. Peg's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. She didn't plead. She simply stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come inside." Robert hesitated. He didn't know if he wanted to. This house held memories of love, of betrayal, of a life that had been stolen. But he had come too far to turn back now. He stepped over the threshold. The house smelled different. It wasn't just the absence of his presence. It was the presence of someone else's. Charlie's. His best friend had made himself comfortable in Robert's life, in his home, in his wife's bed. He clenched his jaw. Peg led him to the kitchen, where she poured another glass of wine with trembling hands. She didn't look at him. Instead, she stared into the deep red liquid as if it held answers. "You married him," Robert said, his voice cold. Peg flinched. "I did. And you forgot about me." She finally met his gaze, her eyes burning with something fierce. "I never forgot you, Robert. Not for a single second." Anger flared in his chest. "Then why?" She took a shaky breath. "Because Charlie made sure I had no reason to look for you." Robert felt the room tilt. The rage he had carried for years wavered, replaced by something else, doubt. "Explain." Peg swallowed hard. "After the accident, Charlie told me you were dead. He even arranged the funeral. There was a body. It was burned beyond recognition. But he said it was you. I believed him. He was my best friend. And I was drowning in grief, Robert. I was alone. I had Lisa to think about." Robert's stomach twisted at the mention of their daughter. He had missed so much. "Then what?" he pressed. Peg looked away, shame washing over her. "He was there for me. At first, I resisted, but he wore me down. I didn't see it for what it was until it was too late. I thought I was clinging to a friend, but he had other plans. He manipulated me, isolated me. Every time I had doubts, he reassured me, told me I needed to move on." She let out a bitter laugh. "And I did, because I thought you were in the ground." Robert clenched his fists. Charlie hadn't just stolen his wife. He had orchestrated the entire thing. Leet, manipulated, ensured that Peg never looked beyond what he wanted her to see. "Lisa?" he asked. Tears spilled down Peg's cheeks. He told her the same lies. She calls him dad now. A blade through his heart wouldn't have hurt as much as that. The room felt suffocating. The walls, once adorned with pictures of their family, now bore no trace of him. Charlie had rewritten history, erased Robert's existence, and stepped into the life that wasn't his to take. "I need to know everything," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every lie, every detail." Peg nodded, wiping at her tears. "There's something else, Robert. Something you don't know." Before she could continue, a sudden noise from the front of the house made them both freeze. A car door slammed. Footsteps. Peg's eyes widened in fear. "He's home." Robert's blood turned to ice. It was time to face the man who had stolen his life. The morning was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of impending rain. The town was just waking up, oblivious to the storm about to unfold. Robert adjusted the collar of his worn leather jacket, his fingers twitching with anticipation. He had waited years for this moment. Beside him, Peg fidgeted, her face pale but determined. Lisa, their daughter, stood slightly behind her mother, uncertainty clouding her eyes. Mary was there too, standing with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen life at its worst and still fought back. Together, they stepped into the police station. The place smelled of stale coffee and paperwork, the air thick with the kind of tired authority that came with years of dealing with criminals. A bored-looking officer behind the front desk barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" Robert stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with an edge of restrained fury. "We're here to report an attempted murder. The man responsible is Charles Ford, and we have evidence." The officer finally looked up, curiosity flickering across his features. Within minutes, They were sitting in a small interrogation room, facing two detectives, seasoned men with skeptical eyes. Mary pulled out her phone and played the recording. "It's taking too long." Charlie's voice growled through the tiny speaker. "We need Robert out of the way again. Permanently this time." There was a long pause. The second detective leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And who exactly is speaking here?" "That's Charlie," Robert said, his voice flat. "And the other voice is Pedro, the same man who tried to kill me years ago." The detective rubbed his chin. "You have any way to prove that?" Mary was ready. She opened a second file on her phone, pictures, timestamps, and messages linking Pedro to Charlie. Financial records showing money transfers. Hotel reservations made in Peg's name by Charlie without her knowledge. The pieces clicked into place like a cruel puzzle. One of the officers exhaled sharply. "Jesus Christ, this isn't just attempted murder. It's conspiracy." Robert leaned forward. "You need to move fast. Charlie isn't the kind of man who lets loose ends dangle." The lead detective stood. "We'll bring him in." The sun had barely reached its peak when the squad cars pulled up to Charlie's mansion. The estate was a symbol of everything he had stolen. Not just money, but lives, trust, love. Charlie was outside on the terrace, sipping whiskey, when he saw the first officer step onto his property. For a moment, he didn't react. Then his gaze shifted to the street where Robert stood, arms crossed. Their eyes locked. Charlie's expression darkened. The officers moved in. "Charles Ford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and fraud." His lips curled into a smirk, but there was tension beneath it. "On what grounds?" "We have a witness. And a recording." Charlie's smirk faltered. Pedro, the man who had once been his loyal enforcer, was now in handcuffs beside him. The betrayal on Charlie's face was almost laughable. "You spineless bastard," Charlie spat at Pedro. Pedro, looking resigned, simply shrugged. "You taught me to survive, boss." As they hauled Charlie toward the police car, he turned to Robert one last time. His eyes burned with fury. "You should have stayed dead." Robert smirked. "You should have been a better friend." The doors slammed shut, and the sirens wailed. Peg stood beside Robert, staring at the spot where Charlie had been taken away. Her face was unreadable. "He fooled me," she whispered. "I let him fool me." Robert exhaled slowly. He wanted to rage, to demand answers, to scream about the years he had lost. But standing there, looking at the woman he had once trusted with his life, all he felt was exhaustion. "It's over now," he said. She turned to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "Regret? Love? Hope? Can we ever fix this?" she asked. Robert didn't answer right away. He looked past her at Lisa, his daughter, who had been caught in the crossfire of this war. Then at Mary, the woman who had helped him find his way back. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know one thing. He won't hurt anyone ever again." Peg nodded, wiping at her eyes. Lisa hesitated, then stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Robert. It was the first real hug in years. "I'm just glad you're back, Dad." Robert closed his eyes, letting the warmth of his daughter's embrace seep into his weary bones. For the first time in years, he felt like a man who had finally come home.